So I'm very happy and excited to present and introduce you to Michaelmas, who is a sociologist at the University of Newcastle, Australia. His research challenges prevailing representation of the encounter between migration and sex work as a matter of trafficking. Through detailed empirical analysis, he focuses on the ambivalent dynamics of exploitation and agency that are implicated in migrant sex work. Awarded an ERC Consolidated Grant on Sexual Humanitarianism, Migration, Sex Work, and Trafficking, he studied the global impact of anti-trafficking legislation and initiatives on the governance of migration and sex industry in the global north by analyzing migrants' own understandings and experiences of agency and exploitation in Australia, France, New Zealand, and the US. And his findings of 20 years of research on migration and sex industry were published in 2018 and won the American Sociology Association's Sexuality Section Distinguished Book Award in 2020. Nick is also a filmmaker and developed a collaborative approach combining fictional filmmaking and ethnographic observational methods through which migrant sex workers own the terms of their representations. This method, called ethnofiction, inspired by the work of Jean Rouch and developed at the Mediterranean Laboratory of Sociology, resulted in the films Code 2020, Travel 2016, Samira 2013, and Normal 2010. Today, he's going to present us the results of SexHum project and will talk about his creative methodological approach. Thank you very much for being here, Nick, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for this welcome and for having invited me. I think the themes and the concerns at the center of this series are very dear to my heart and very close to my scholarship. So I think this is quite a good fit. Before I start my presentation, I would actually, as a start of my presentation, I wanted to share the website of the project, which is just one second, because it contains the definition of sexual humanitarianism that is actually the acronym of the project I'm going to present. One second, because I am making a bit of a mess of this. Right. So SexHum is an acronym of sexual humanitarianism, which is a concept that I have created to talk about how in contemporary times the humanitarian concerns about people's gender and sexuality and their vulnerability to exploitation in relation to it have become the embedding territory, the embedding mechanism for social interventions that are normally translating or sometimes translating in anti-migration and anti-sex work initiatives. So this critical uptake on humanitarianism, of course, is based on existing critiques of military humanitarianism, which, like sexual humanitarianism, refer to the instrumentalization, but also to the constitutional ambivalence within humanitarian discourses of dynamics of both support, help, and control. Sexuality has also become a very important topic for the investment of politics, and the spectacular rhetoric, and this is a quote from Wendy Hesford, that frames issues of sex trafficking, which is a shorthand for the trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, if you want, dominate the imaginary of the encounter between migration and the sex industry. If we Google migration, sex, and sex work, you will see that the majority of returns will talk about trafficking. And trafficking refers to a very specific crime. It's a terrible crime which is defined by the 2000 Palermo Protocol, UN protocol, as the deception and the use of force, deception and violence and abuse to force people to be exploited in different forms of labor, including and for prostitution, which is singled out as different from other forms of labor. As you know, the issue of sex work is a very contentious one, very politicized one within feminism itself. There are many different sensibilities addressing prostitution or sex work. The very name prostitution or sex work are contested. So there is, I will simplify and you will be aware of this. There are two main interpretations in this concerns. One is self-proclaimed as radical feminism and defines prostitution and not sex work. It doesn't define that as sex work as a form of gender exploitation, gender-based exploitation. And so as part of a patriarchal exploitative system within which men have access to the bodies of women, which leaves no space for agentic and voluntary involvement in prostitution, and which seeks to abolish prostitution as a social evil by criminalizing clients. So this approach tends to translate in the end of demand policymaking framework, which paradoxically reiterates very neoliberal understanding of social relations in terms of demand and offer, as if the sexual transaction and libidinal transaction that is framed through the sale of sexual services could be reduced to an economic transaction. So the idea is that by cutting or stopping the demand for sexual services, prostitution will go away. On the other side of the spectrum of feminism, there are so-called liberal feminists who actually recognize that women can use patriarchy, can manipulate a position within patriarchy, but they can also, sell sexual services to their own advantage. And by doing that, they can assert a sense of agency. So this is the field within which the project took place, a field which is very politicized because it touches political and social taboos such as migration and sex work and sexuality, which are super invested politically and culturally and socially, right? So the project took place in 4 countries, the US, France, Australia, and New Zealand, which were chosen because they are magnets for migration in the global north, but also because they are the expression of different attitudes and different policymaking approaches in relations to sex work. For example, the United States is a country where, apart from a few counties in Nevada, in rural Nevada, sex work in terms of both the purchase and sale of sexual services is forbidden. It's criminalized. In France, recently, a neo-abolitionist and a radical feminist policymaking framework, which is also called as the Nordic model or Swedish model, criminalizing clients as a way to abolish prostitution, was introduced in 2016. And it has to be said that at the core of this model is not only the criminalization of clients, but is also the decriminalization of women, because women are framed as victims of the patriarchal system. And I'm saying women, even though prostitution, sex work is a practice that actually involves men and cis and trans men and women and gender non-binary people, because the focus of neo-abolitionist policy makings are women, who form the majority of people working in the sex industry, but by no means all of them. And in a city like London, for example, or in big K capitals of the world, it is estimated that about 40 to 30% of people working in the sex industry are men. So this is something that we need to take into consideration. Then next is New Zealand. New Zealand has been seen as a paradigm for decriminalization because the sale and purchase of sex in almost every form is legal. And New Zealand has been used by pro-sex worker rights advocates as an example. However, from a migration perspective, New Zealand is very problematic because although people working in the sex industry in New Zealand are decriminalized, migrants are not, and they are not because of anti-trafficking concerns. So there is a double tier of rights in New Zealand. So whereas local citizens are entitled to the full protection of the law, migrants are not. And this is why, as you will see, in New Zealand, migrants were pushed underground and face many problems. Last but by not being least, in the state of New South Wales, we found the most decriminalized actually model because in New South Wales, people who are on short term contract are also entitled to work in the sex industry legally. So for example, if you're a student and you can work 20 hours, you can decide to work 20 hours in a so-called shop, that's how they're called, rather than, or as well as in other jobs, which means that if there are issues, you know, of exploitation with clients or people not paying, then you can go to the police. It's as simple as that, and you're protected, right? So I now stop sharing and go to the PowerPoint presentation, where I will give you the results of the project, and also I will start moving towards what I think is the most interesting thing for you, given the topic of this presentation, which is the methodology through which this data, you know, the data of the project have been gathered. So let me share again, right, this time the PowerPoint, right? So, right, so the project Sexum studies the relation between migration, sex work, and trafficking in these 4 strategic sex work and migration sites in the global north. And it focuses on migrant sex workers' own understanding of agency and exploitation. This is very important because everybody but the people directly concerned tend to be listened to when it comes down to sex work. And sex worker activists have been claiming, you know, and fighting for their rights for a very long time. But they tend to be pathologized or not listened to because of they're cornered into the category of vulnerability. And it's as if people who are in a vulnerable situation cannot speak. Well, actually they can, they just need to be listened to. And also as if, and this is part of the problem that is at the core of sexual humanitarianism. You know, there are politics of victimhood and politics of vulnerability that are mobilized on the one hand to highlight a problem, but then when the people directly concerned talk about the solutions, they are not listened to. So this is the novelty of the project. We listen to them and we try to understand how they understand their own agency and exploitation rather than having fixed, you know, top-down approaches to it. And we did it through a coherent, innovative, and creative methodology. Of course, I was the PI of this, so I did not do, I couldn't possibly do fieldwork in 4 major countries. And I coordinated a research team, which was brilliant. And so these are the names of the researchers who undertook up to 36 months of fieldwork in these countries. So it's based on, the project is based on long-term ethnographic observation. This is very important because sex work is super stigmatized, and migrant sex work is even more stigmatized because there's double intersectional layers of marginalization, and therefore you need a lot of time to establish a relationship of trust and credibility with the people directly concerned and with the associations and organizations supporting them for all the right reasons, of course. And within this, we did quantitative interviewing. We gathered 240 interviews across the 4 sites. Sorry, iTunes kicked in. I don't know what I did. Right, I'm getting rid of it. Okay, and last but not least, we did participative ethnographic filmmaking, ethnofiction, as it was already mentioned. I'm very much influenced by the work of Jean Rouch, whose motto was that only fiction can penetrate reality. Now, I'm quite critical of the notion of knowledge as penetration. It's quite phallic, and I don't think it's very contemporary. But what it tried to say is that only fiction sometimes can capture reality. So what we did is that we used collaborative participatory filmmaking not only as a way to illustrate the data of the project, but as a way to gather them. Yeah. And so, for example, as I will explain more in detail later, what we did is that in two of the countries, in France and in America, in the US, we collaborated with two migrant sex worker grassroots organizations. And we asked them, if you were to tell a story about yourself, if you went to tell a story about yourself and your membership, what would the story be like? What happens in it? And who are the protagonists? This method is quite important because it allows people who are stigmatized to negotiate their visibility. The field of sex work and migration is full of humanitarian pseudo-documentaries, which peddle very trite notions of victimhood. And that in a way may render visible only absolute and pure forms of victims, like the victim of trafficking who is completely innocent. And I'm using the concept of innocent, critically drawing on the study of Miriam Tichting that deconstructs how the metaphor of innocence is key to the construction of the good victim or of the good victim or the legitimate victim. So the films also make an artistic and political intervention into a regime of representation that only render visible innocent complete victims and does not actually give any visibility to people whose trajectories are more complex, are more nuanced, and actually represent the experiences of the majority of the people who are directly concerned. Okay, more on this later. Right, now, sorry, right. So we try to gather the experience also of a great variety of people working in the sex industry. Again, the stereotype about people working in the sex industry is a woman in fishnet and stilettos on a curb, and selling sex in the street and leaning towards a car, smoking a cigarette under a street lamp. This is the kind of iconography that have been bombarded in films and other visual products over and over. However, the sex industry is a massive sector of economic production. Just think about porn, think about webcamming, think about brothels. And think about and then of course street-based modeling and striptease and escorting, and also it is a place where there are lots of different trajectories in relation to gender identity, class, and race. As I said before, all of the debates and controversies tend to focus on the realities of women, but actually, there are a variety of populations. But also what we try to do is we try to include racialized and sex-gender minorities as research participants because they represent, they are particularly targeted by sexual humanitarian interventions, and also because they tend to be the most marginalized and excluded populations and most criminalized within there, as we will see shortly. Right, so let's now talk about the results of the project in terms of country by country, starting from the least criminalized to the more criminalized. So, as I said, in Australia, we focused on New South Wales, which is a partially decriminalized environment, partially because sex work in the street is very strictly regulated. It cannot be near a school, near a church, near lots of things that basically makes it very arbitrary to understand where it can actually happen. But in itself, it is totally legal. And in New South Wales is regulated through not a licensing system, but an authorization system, which is given to the council according to planning the kind of priorities and needs. So it's the Department of Planning that authorizes sexual entertainment venues. So in Australia, also because of the draconian bordering system that is in place, there are very low numbers of migrants without visa, very low numbers of victims of trafficking in the sex industry, historically, and even less so now. And there is a growing awareness of slavery in sectors other than sex works, because trafficking as a concept was reignited and reactivated in the 90s, and then was solidified with the Palermo Protocol in 2000 in relationship to sex work, to cases of exploitation in the sex industry, and then was expanded to look into other sectors of migrant labor, and then was co-opted into the broader terms of modern slavery, which is even more problematic, but I don't have time to go into today. And you can refer to the work of Julia Connor Davidson and Bridget Anderson and many others about that. Right. So there are in Australia as well cyclic anti-decriminalization, neo-abolitionist critiques, triggering moral panics and trying to problematize the law in order to advocate for the closing down of the sex industry, because that's the target of that particular feminist ideology. And so what we found in Australia is that there was a controversy about Asian sex workers. Asian because, it's a floaty signifier. Asian means different things in different geopolitical and cultural contexts. But in the case of Australia, Asian means Southeast Asian in the UK. That's how it's read. So the exploitation of Asian sex workers in non-authorized massage parlors. So the assumption was, because they're not authorized, anything goes, and these people are at the mercy of their employers. So this is what we focused our attention on in Australia. There are also raids of immigration, police and councils, both in Victoria and in New South Wales, always under the kind of context of anti-trafficking and of implementation of the law. And there are also, well, this is a minor point. So what happens, what we found in Australia is that those speculations about there being a higher number of exploitative cases in non-authorized brothels did not happen at all. On the contrary, women told us that because if you want, sex work was not on the menu, because people went to massage parlors that only sold massages, and sex work was an option to be negotiated away from the owner, they retained more control because the owner didn't know, and they could negotiate with the client what they wanted. And also they did not have to pay the owner a quota of what they did. So it was completely the opposite of what was said. But there are always this kind of very spectacularizing, very kind of dramatic moral panics about the sex industry, which tend not to be based on reality. I mean, I've been working on this issue for 20 years now, and my data have consistently demonstrated that only a minority of people working in the sex industry, and I'm talking about migrants, are victims of trafficking. These qualitative findings have been corroborated also by statistical numbers. That doesn't mean, coming from institutional kind of data, which doesn't mean that sex trafficking does not exist or that it isn't a concern. But the message has passed that the opposite is true. So when one reads articles, it seems like the majority of migrants working in the sex industry are exploited or are victims of trafficking. That is not true. The opposite is true, right? A minority is. And so we need to find out the policies that make sense for migrants and the policies that actually address the minority without damaging the majority. A bit like the issue of collateral damage in the bombing of countries, right? There was a famous report by Anti-Slavery International on anti-trafficking called Collateral Damages, because to save the 10% of people or 15% of people who might be in a situation of trafficking, then you damage and deport the life of the 85%. France, as I said, the law was applied in 2016. The criminalization of clients and the decriminalization of soliciting coincide with an increase in municipal restrictions orders. So you have this law coming in, but you also have in many major cities, municipal decrees pushing people out of particularly gentrifying areas, and these kind of displacements, which we have also seen in Soho, are very problematic. And I'm talking about Soho, UK. They're also in France, they offered exiting programs for people who wanted to leave prostitution, who want to leave sex work, which gave people the possibility of obtaining ×3, 6 months papers. So a lot of migrants actually were attracted to it, but then in many prefectures, they did not apply this because of the fear that they would create a parallel immigration channel. This is the same concern we've got with unaccompanied minors. So whenever there is a humanitarian instrument, which could be seen as benevolent and as offering a way out of duress for people who feel like that, and there are many who do, then there is a political speculations about the system being manipulated. And so it is applied in ways that actually tend to marginalize people who need it most. And this is something that we found in France, particularly among the Nigerian and Chinese women who said, well, we don't understand what it's for. I'm supposed to speak French very well. I'm supposed to declare that I never will work in the sex industry anymore, while receiving 340 euro. Actually, it's less than that. I think it's 300 euros a month as an indemnity. And I remember when we did a research in 2014 before this project, and we asked Nigerian women whether they would give up sex work for 340 euro a month. The question I got back was per day, which gives you a bit of an idea of of the disparity between what people can earn in so-called straight jobs and what people can earn in the sex industry, which is why then sex work becomes is seen as a relatively less exploitative practice than the straight mainstream jobs that migrants are, have access to. This is a bigger finding, but it turns on its head again, this perception of sex work as a last resort, because actually in many cases, migrants have already been through a range of normal jobs, underpaid and exploitative, and found selling sex less exploitative. And this poses the question, what is the nature of migrant labor in neoliberal times? Why do we focus only on sex work, which is actually better paid, and not focus on sandwich cutting or working in agriculture or being exploited in the construction sites, right? Okay, so the law was a disaster in France. I'm not missing my word here. Not that I ever do. It produced the further precariousness of sex workers. They had to do more time for less money. So what is interesting is that if you look at the premises of the law aimed at reducing the exploitation of people, of women particularly, by subtracting them from a situation of structural exploitation, which is equated to sex work, right? But for people who are inside sex work, it translated into clients who are law abiding, not coming up anymore. So there was a decrease of income, and people then had to accept clients who were dangerous, who led to an increase in violence and abuse from criminals and clients, right? So there is a perverse relationship between the intentions of these neo-abolitionist laws and the way they actually translate on practices on the ground, which is why we need to focus as social scientists, I think, on what these laws produce, because I think we can all agree that there is a very strong element of gender inequality, framing prostitution as a sex work and prostitution as a occupation. But we also need to recognize these inequalities in other sectors, but we also need to support people who are involved in these practices in ways that do not cause harm. And these laws do. It also translated in people leaving Paris, for example, particularly trans Latina people who were under HIV and AIDS treatment in order to go to places where there were less surveillance. And in some cases, people developed AIDS because they could not continue the tree therapy. In 2016, can you imagine that because of the law in 2016, in a country like France, which has got a pervasive NHS system, people develop AIDS because of anti-abolitionist, of neo-abolitionist concerns. That's not really acceptable. So we've collaborated with Doctors of the World in a research which was published in 2018. These are some of the numbers. I don't want to take up all the time of my talk, but just to give you an idea, 63% of sex workers experience deterioration of the living condition. 78% experience a loss of income because there was a decrease in a number of clients and because rates fell. 42% of sex workers are more exposed to violence. 38% found it increasingly hard to demand the use of condom. This is very important because when something is criminalized of the sexual transaction, whether you criminalize the clients or you criminalize the sex worker, the transaction is criminalized. And so it goes underground, which means that there is less time for the sex worker to scan, negotiate, and actually filter and assess the danger associated. That's why decriminalization is a more favorable harm reduction paradigm, is because it allows all of these very complex negotiations to take place with the time they need. Right. New Zealand decriminalized sex work in 2003, but as I said, migrants are excluded. There are very low number of cases of trafficking, also because, again, of the geographical position of New Zealand, as is the case of Australia, because it's a bit more complicated getting into those two countries than getting into any European country because of the border and the fact that they are remote islands. But at the same time, the low number of cases of trafficking also diverts attentions from very diffuse cases of exploitation of migrant sex workers, particularly Asian and particularly Chinese migrant sex workers, because of their irregular status. New Zealand was the place which we did not expect at all, where it was most difficult to conduct the research, because in 2017, there was a very xenophobic political campaign, which led to, which translated into a heightened attention to migration dynamics and an increase in deportation rates in the name of anti-trafficking, right? And the whole industry went underground to the point that organizations that historically supported sex workers in terms of distributing condoms and doing prevention of STDs found it difficult to reach their populations. I mean, and so in that context, we really struggled to meet also the number of interviews that we were supposed to meet. Okay, so in the United States, but again, so these are the limits. So our recommendation for New Zealand is that the law that decriminalizes prostitution, which is very successful when it comes down to Kiwi, sex workers or people with permanent residence, that this law is extended to migrants as well. New Zealand is a country where if a client doesn't pay you, you can go to the police and the police forces the client to pay. Why isn't that available to migrants, right? Or if there is a dispute with your boss, then or a withdrawal of payment, then that can be resolved through the normal kind of legal avenue. So that's the kind of finding we came to. United States, very sad story, I'm afraid. In the United States, we focused on Los Angeles and on New York City. I'm going to focus on New York City because New York City was the main site, but also because it's also the site of the film that I'm going to show you the trailer of. So New York City was very interesting because even though sex work is criminalized, there were sexual humanitarian institutions such as the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts that are diversion courts through which people's criminal records are cleared if people attend a mandatory a number of sessions. So, if you are caught selling sex in New York, and there are lots of undercover operations, so it's not like something that is rare. There is a huge pressure also on vice squads to meet quotas and numbers, so it's ongoing, right? But if you're caught, you have the choice of being framed as a victim of trafficking, because in the UK, in the United States, trafficking is a floating signifier that became equivalent to sex work, right? Because it's criminalized, the only way you can get away with it, with criminalization, is framing yourself as a victim. So if you frame yourself as a victim, you go to these courts, and you don't have to declare yourself guilty or not. You just attend these sessions and you don't get a criminal record. But if in 6 months you do not reoffend, but if this is your only job, how can you not reoffend, right? So these are revolving doors through which benevolent revolving doors through which sex workers, go through and feed, the humanitarian kind of industry, because there's a whole kind of service industry around this. Some of these sessions are quite useful. So in some NGOs that are affiliated with the court offer sexual health screenings or language classes. Others, they offer a socioeconomic rehabilitation course in 6 hours, which, it's quite risible thinking about the level of racialized marginalization that some of the people who are involved in these dynamics, have experienced historically, let alone socially. Right. So coming to which, there are a high number of domestic adult cases in the US, but remember that sex work is equated with trafficking. And also we witness the criminalization of racialized poverty. When you go to the courts, the vast majority of defendants are African American cis women, because in America, the definition of trafficking encompasses any form of prostitution, depending on, it's quite arbitrary. And then Asia cis women, and again, Asian over there means Southeast Asian, and Latinx trans women. These are the vast majority of defendants, in a context where there is no welfare state, no universal welfare state. And so paradoxically, the discourse that one hears is the arresting to assist ethos, meaning given that some support is only available as a post-incrimination and post-detention reinsertion kind of initiative, then sometimes you hear the discourse, well, it's not so bad if people get to be arrested, at least they will get some support, which is quite tragic, because there's no prevention of structural socioeconomic marginalization. On this already quite dysfunctional landed Donald Trump in 2016, which brought, sorry, iTunes really wants to play with me today, but I don't want to, so right. Make things, no surprise there. And so what happened is that under Donald Trump, there was such a focus on deportation and on very spectacular and visible ways of deportation that the Immigration and Custom Enforcement, the ICE, border force, started deporting people at the tribunal. So we are talking about people who are defending their cases of trafficking, right? So that was something that created an outrage with judges preventing the police from entering the courtroom, but not being able to do much more, because it's ICE is a federal force, and so they have a lot of power. What happened as well is that in the US, in a bipartisan fashion, so this is something that is interesting in terms of sexual humanitarianism, because the rhetoric of the fight against trafficking is something that is embraced both by the left and by the right, particularly in Europe, but also this is the case in the United States. So what happens with Sesta Posta is that website carrying adverts of sex workers, like Backpage, were made liable of trafficking in case instances of trafficking were found, which means that in order to cut their losses, these major sources of income for sex workers canceled the adverts, and that pushed people to the street, where they became more vulnerable to forms of criminalization by the police, and of course by violent clients and criminals. Because in a criminalized context, a criminal gang, can take advantage, of course, of a migrant who is not going to go to the police for fear of being deported. And so when people know it, then sex workers, particularly racialized sex workers and people working in the street, become an easy way of making money. Right. So findings, and we are focusing on policymaking, are that there is an inversely proportional relationship between the degree of criminalization of sex work and the ability for migrants and non-migrant sex workers to assert their rights and live their lives. So the more criminalization, the least people are able to fight for their rights and to have justice. And decriminalization of all forms of sex work is a fundamental starting point to counter the social and economic vulnerabilities and the violence, abuse, and exploitation which can be associated with sex work. But particularly racialized people told us that it was only a starting point because it was not enough. They said that decriminalization was for white people. That was something that I really did not expect to hear and that I learned from the project. Because they said even if sex work tomorrow was decriminalized, this was particularly very strong from African-American women and trans-Latina people. They said we're still going to be visible, we're still going to be discriminated according to our racialization and the way in which and transphobia, and we're still going to be marginalized according to existing social hierarchies. So they said decriminalization, very good, but it needs to be associated with policies supporting people who are excluded from work, housing, and society because of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, and migration status, right? Which is a powerful force of discrimination. Right. So these are the findings of the project. I would now like to talk a little bit more about the films, and most important, to show you the films, because I've already talked to you about the method. And so we did two films, one with the Colectivo Intercultural Transgrediendo, which is a grassroots organization of Latinx trans women. And they collaborated with the project, and we wrote together Caer, caught, which means being arrested. And Caer is the result of many workshops of creative writing, which led to a story which was then filmed in New York in September 2019, before the pandemic nightmare kicked off rather. And the film is based on the juxtaposition of these fictionalized scripts, which show the two protagonists in a variety of situations, fighting, escaping police persecution, but also filing for a case a case of trafficking in order to have their rights recognized, and also these fictionalized scenes are juxtaposed to observational scenes in which, for example, we filmed them preparing for a big demo that they did in Queens, where they're based, or we also filmed the editing feedback session, during which they actually provided feedback and reflected on the film, and that is also part of the movie. And so I'm going to show you that. 1 second. Right. Oh, right, it's here.
Hi, Nicola. We cannot hear the trailer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll put it from the beginning. Sorry about that.
Nosotros tenemos nuestras cuentas de banco, compramos el café en la esquina, vamos a hacer compras al supermercado. Nosotros vivimos en Queens. Nosotros necesitamos el respeto.
Estamos penalizando el trabajo sexual para que ninguna persona que caiga arrestada sea criminalizada ahora en adelante.
Were you ever arrested for prostitution?
Por su visa.
Estamos haciendo una sesión donde estamos hablando la verdad de la vida que se vive, de nosotras, las chicas trans, o sea, todas hemos pasado, entonces, no es algo ficticio, es algo real.
Right, so this was Caer, and last but not least, the second film we managed to do in the context of the film. Oh, sorry. Sorry, it's you know, YouTube, how it goes. They decide what comes next. No responsibility on my side. Right, so the second film we did was in France, and we were supposed to do the same thing we did with the Translatinas in New York. So we worked with Rose Dacier, which is an association of Chinese migrant women, particularly involved in the sex industry. And we wrote the script, but then the pandemic hit. And so we need to find a plan B to make the film happen while respecting the safety measures and also reflecting the new situation. So what we did was a meta discussion of the script online and offline, illustrated by drawings, which we commissioned from an illustrator who had already experience as a volunteer of Médecins du Monde, of Doctors of the World, who knew the context, and also by lots of scenes taken from the everyday lives of the women themselves. So this is the trailer of Plan B, after which, I think we can have a chat about, I can answer questions and everything.
We don't see it, Nicola.
Right.
Can you please share your screen?
Yeah. I definitely can. There you go.
记不记得在我们几个人改过之后，那丽丽变成了一个更温和的人，甚至是一个更弱一点性格的人。我们为什么要把丽丽设置成这样一个人？
就那么紧啊？哦，好，我们已经准备好了。
录音都开了吗
OK，
大家下午好，我们现在开始拍电影了。我们今天电影开拍大卖。
因为我当时在北楼为了上班的，因为14年左右，对吧？那个时候等于说是，那个时候站街是等于说是不容许的，黑下来就怕的就是警察嘛，反正只要瞄到警察就跑，快，姐妹，是警察来了，大家都是从中国来到这里的，是不是？能帮到，如果在那边他有一个便衣过来，肯定会，哎呦，快使个眼色，快警察来了。
就是我是最早，我是09年到这里来的。
12个月以后啊，6个月以后，很多女的等于说，没有纸张了，等于说就黑下来了嘛。
我觉得他们不喜欢颧骨太高的女人。J'ai l'impression, hein, quand ils ont expliqué, elles n'aiment pas des femmes qui sont trop haut ici.
发票开始以后，等于说我们就这短短几年里面死了好几个姐妹，死亡率真的比以前高很多。
对这个很大的影响，就出台的这个法，担心没有个人，担心现在他是不是坏人，是抢劫的。
人家就是一个国家出台这个法律，不是我们来改变的。
我们也去了，我们也去了游行了，我们也去抗议了，是吧？
但是我们的力量还是太小。
就是每个人谈梦想，梦想不知道什么时候发生，不发生，这个东西发生不了。
Right. So that was Plan B, and this is also the end of my talk. I'd rather stop here so we can have some times for questions and answers. Thank you.